Ever wonder why progestogenic 19 or testosterone derivatives like Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone give you terrible seal skin, making you look like a rhinoceros even at sub 6% body fat? Me too, buddy. Me too. So I did my absolute best to piece it together in the scientific literature, and with some highly dubious extrapolation, I think I finally got it figured out. Vigorous Steve here. While the correlation between skin thickness and Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone hasn't really been directly investigated, we do know in the enhanced bodybuilding and strength athlete community that progestogenic 19-or testosterone derivatives tend to give you seal skin in a dose-dependent fashion. And while that might not be very noticeable during the off-season when you're fluffy as because you're slamming a boatload of carbohydrates and all of the growth hormone and insulin that you're taking, once you try to get extra diced for a bodybuilding competition or your next summer holiday, that seal skin can be quite the deal breaker. And as always, if you'd like me to make a follow-up video on how to thin the skin with various diet testosterone derivatives and dietary practices, just sound off in the comment section and I'll get to work on it. First, let me briefly explain on which hormones contribute to the formation and growth of the various layers of the skin and how certain performance-enhancing drugs overlap with the bioidentical hormones that you produce endogenously, albeit that when you do take exogenous steroids, that endogenous sex hormone production is severely downregulated, right? So you might need to supplement with a little bit of testosterone converting into estradiol downstream. We have the epidermis, the outer layer of the skin, in which case growth hormone, IGF-1, T3, estrogens, testosterone, progesterone, cortisol, corticosterone, vitamin D3, and a melanocyte-stimulating hormone contribute to the growth and formation and cell differentiation. For the papillary and reticular dermis, the middle layer of the skin, besides the previously mentioned hormones, diet testosterone also contributes to the growth and formation of this skin layer. And for the hypodermis, the subcutaneous layer and the adipose tissue, which is the body fat layer, insulin, leptin, gastric inhibitory polypeptide, also known as glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, estrogens, testosterone, diet testosterone, progesterone, cortisol, corticosterone, growth hormone, insulin growth factor 1 and 2, T3, glucagon, noradrenaline, and actually a boatload of other hormones which helps with lipogenesis or lipolysis. Now, these hormones, which I just mentioned, all fulfill various effects in these layers of the skin, but the gist of it is that they either contribute to cell proliferation, collagen synthesis and deposition, protein turnover and catabolism, and again, like I mentioned before, lipogenesis or lipolysis. These hormonal effects ultimately regulate skin thickness or thinness, however you want to look at it, and such contributing hormones include growth hormone, IGF-1, testosterone, diet testosterone, estrogens, and progesterone. And for the sake of this video, we're solely going to focus on progesterone because through this pathway, the progesterone receptor is how progestogenic 19-or testosterone derivatives like Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone thicken the skin. And I must emphasize that this is regardless of how much circulating growth hormone, IGF-1, testosterone, diet testosterone, or estradiol is present from exogenous sources, albeit that there's a very large overlapping effect. So if everything is high and progestogenic 19-or testosterone derivatives are added, now you get thickening of the skin through the growth hormone receptor, the IGF-1 receptor, the androgen receptor, the estrogen receptor, and the progesterone receptors. But let's have a look at the effects of progesterone on the skin first. Progesterone regulates epidermal barrier function, which regulates skin thickness. This promotes epidermal keratinocyte proliferation and differentiation, and also reduces transepidermal water loss. Keratinocytes are the predominant cells of the epidermis, which are responsible for forming a protective barrier against environmental damage. And by supporting the growth and maturation of these keratinocytes, progesterone helps to maintain the thickness and integrity of the epidermis. A strong epidermal barrier prevents moisture loss from the skin and protects against environmental pollutants and pathogens. Progesterone regulates dermis fibroblast function, regulates collagen and elastin synthesis, offers structural support, skin elasticity, firmness, thickness, dermal repair, and regeneration. Progesterone contributes to hypodermal adipose tissue metabolism, where it regulates lipogenesis and lipolysis, regulates insulin sensitivity, promotes pre-adipocyte to adipocyte differentiation, which basically is adipogenesis, the formation of new fat cells. Progesterone influences body fat distribution to the hips, thighs, and breasts, or chest if you're a man. Progesterone contributes to hydration and moisture retention in all layers of the skin, not just the epidermis. Progesterone stimulates hyaluronic acid and glycosaminoglycans production. Progesterone contributes to wound healing through anti-inflammatory effects, promotes proliferation and migration of skin cells in all layers of the skin, injury site angiogenesis, which is a formation of new blood vessels, whether you take BBC 157 or TB500 or not, but there might be an overlapping effect regarding angiogenesis at the site of injury if progesterone levels or progesterone signaling alongside TB500 and BBC 157 is somewhat elevated. And progesterone contributes to collagen and elastin synthesis during wound healing as well. It also contributes to sebaceous gland function, which increases sebum production, which is clearly established in the scientific literature, but we're going to glance over this. And serum fluctuations of progesterone contribute to acne formation predominantly. Serum progesterone levels rise throughout pregnancy and often end up anywhere between 150 to 300 times that compared to baseline during normal menstrual cycles. And that often results in thickening of the skin and acne formation, especially towards the tail end of pregnancy. Although, let's be honest, pregnancy is a giant roller coaster of hormonal fluctuations, and the steep caloric surplus that many of these soon-to-be mothers find themselves in surely contributes to the skin getting thicker and thicker and the acne getting worse and worse. As progesterone levels decline with age, collagen production decreases, leading to the formation of wrinkles and loose and sagging skin and an overall reduction of skin thickness. But of course, as you age, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, estradiol, growth hormone, and IGF-1 levels also decrease, surely contributing to these aging effects as well. Testosterone and IGF-1 are known to stimulate the secretion of epidermal growth factor, which contributes to the proliferation of the epidermal and epithelial cells. And we can assume that Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone, being androgens after all, stimulate epidermal growth factor similarly or to a comparable amount as testosterone does. And we also know, based on the best dose of Trenbolone video, that Trenbolone actually increases serum IGF-1 levels either from liver production or autocrine signaling, especially in the presence of estradiol, which might have an overlapping effect regarding the thickness of the epidermis. And while Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone ultimately lower serum progesterone levels often to undetectable levels because they downregulate the hypothalamic pituitary testicular axis, they do potentiate comparable progesterogenic activity by activating the progesterone receptors with various affinities. Assuming the dose is high enough, these progesterogenic effects in the various layers of the skin might far exceed endogenously produced progesterone at normal concentrations. And when I say high dosages, it's probably less than 1 milligram 19-testosterone derivative per day, discounting for the ester, because apparently adult men produce anywhere between 0.4 to 0.75 milligrams progesterone daily. So you don't have to take much to get comparable progesterogenic activity, and if you take supraphysiological amounts, guess what? You're going to thicken the epidermis, papillary and reticular dermis, the hypodermis, and maybe even adipose tissue, assuming that the caloric intake is high enough. Pregnenolone supplementation still isn't a common occurrence during steroid cycles, and if it's being used, it simply isn't dosed high enough to the point serum progesterone levels rise to the point it starts to thicken the skin. And neither is oral micronized progesterone being commonly used to improve libido or to help with sleep quality. So if you start to notice that your skin is getting thicker, it's not the pregnenolone, it's not the progesterone, it's the 19-testosterone derivatives potentiating progesterone-like effects through similar receptors, but you're taking them in super duper physiological amounts. All right, let's have a look at the relative binding affinities of 19-testosterone derivatives and see how they compare to endogenously produced testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, estradiol, or progesterone. And again, we're pulling this information from a multitude of different sources. As always, citations are down below. Based on these results, you see that Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone all have significantly higher relative binding affinities for the androgen receptors when compared to testosterone, and the comparable transcriptional activity compared to dihydrotestosterone, albeit that testosterone converts at about, let's say, 2 to 4% into dihydrotestosterone. So if serum dihydrotestosterone concentrations are very trace and minute, but you potentiate similar transcriptional activity in a, let's say, molecule for molecule fashion, then if you take superphysiological amounts of a 19-testosterone derivative, that's significant transcriptional activity. And before I forget, Trestolone has significantly higher transcriptional activity compared to testosterone. So let's assume you produce endogenously 6 to 7 milligrams testosterone per day, and 2 to 3% of that converts into testosterone. Then when you go on a low dose of medical TRT of, let's say, 150 milligrams testosterone per week, and you combine that with 50 milligrams of any of these 19-testosterone derivatives, can be 50 milligrams Nandrolone, 50 milligrams Trenbolone, or 50 milligrams Trestolone, that's a significant increase in androgen receptor-mediated gene transcription, some of which will occur in the various layers of the skin, which compounds with the rise in epidermal growth factor. Moving over to the estrogen receptors and the relative binding affinities of Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone. Luckily for us, the relative binding affinity and transcriptional activity is reasonably low. So I don't think that's something you have to worry about. Uniquely to Trestolone, it might block the estrogen receptors with very small affinity, so it blocks its own metabolite, 7-alpha-methyl estradiol, but Nandrolone and Trenbolone potentiate trace minute activation of the estrogen alpha receptors and trace minute relative transcriptional activity when compared to estradiol. But Nandrolone is a metabolic intermediate in the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. And when you take exogenous Nandrolone, even at low and effective dosages of 50 milligrams weekly, serum estradiol levels tend to go up disproportionately. So even though Nandrolone doesn't really potentiate any estrogenic activity, albeit in small trace minute amounts, if serum estradiol levels go up, you still get skin thickening effects by directly activating the estrogen receptors with estradiol. So maybe it's wise to put some sort of aromatase inhibition in place. And here you see that Nandrolone, Trenbolone, and Trestolone all have mild to moderate relative binding affinity for the progesterone receptors when compared to progesterone. And while I wasn't able to find the transcriptional activity of Nandrolone and Trenbolone, the relative transcriptional activity of Trestolone when compared to progesterone is 238. So that's reasonably high. So based on these results, you could extrapolate, albeit highly dubious extrapolation, that you get similar relative transcriptional activity as endogenously produced progesterone as an adult man if you take between 200 micrograms to 400 micrograms Trestolone acetate daily, which is the exact same dose investigated in the clinical trials for Trestolone acetate implants, right? I'll link that video at the end of this one. While topical testosterone creams, gels, and patches are known to cause skin irritation at the site of application in some cases, they aren't known for their skin thickening side effects. Glucocorticoid steroid creams, however, do the exact opposite. They're known to thin the skin with continuous applications, as they have a catabolic effect on the collagen and elastin tissue, weakening the skin's overall structural integrity. And here are some examples of glucocorticoid steroid creams which are known to thin the skin over time. And these skin thinning effects by glucocorticoids, including cortisol and corticosterone, might be inhibited by Trenbolone's mild antagonistic effects on the glucocorticoid receptors, preventing cortisol and corticosterone, and perhaps some of these creams, if they're being used in conjunction, from signaling for protein degradation in the skin, resulting in an overall anabolic effect. And while these effects are greatly desired in skeletal muscle, resulting in pronounced anabolism, these anticatabolic effects might also prevent the skin from remaining in normal homeostasis regarding skin thickness, increasing collagen, elastin, and overall protein content over time. In the scientific literature, there isn't really any concrete indication that Nandrolone, Trenbolone, or Trestolone thicken the skin, and that's probably because the dosages are reasonably low and not anywhere close to the dosages that bodybuilders or strength athletes use. 19-testosterone derivatives were administered medically or during the clinical trials between 1.4 milligrams to 200 milligrams weekly. Now, of course, Nandrolone decanoate at 200 milligrams weekly does sound a little bit appealing, and there are two studies, which we'll address a little bit later on, that do show that Nandrolone potentiate some skin thickening effects. But to be fair, if you're a normal human being that doesn't have a single-digit body fat levels and is covered in microveins everywhere, then it's very unlikely that you'll observe skin thickening effects from these 19-testosterone derivatives, simply because you're not so in tune with your body. But when we talk to bodybuilders who are very in tune with their body and almost have obsessive and compulsive disorder regarding their physical appearance, then they will tell you that from 50 milligrams Trenbolone, Nandrolone, or Trestolone onwards, that there's almost a dose-dependent increase in skin thickness. And even in the clinical trials where Trestolone acetate was administered as a topical gel formulation, there's no mention of changes to skin thickness. And in the other clinical trials where Trestolone acetate was implanted subcutaneously into the upper arm, while there's instances of post-implantation pain, there's also no mention of changes to skin thickness, whether that's localized or systemic. But there are two studies that I want to highlight regarding Nandrolone's potential skin thickening effects. First study is performed by Sardar et al., published on July-August 2010, titled Therapeutic Effects of Nandrolone and Testosterone in Adult Male HIV Patients with AIDS Wasting Syndrome, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. In this study, adult male HIV-positive patients received either 150 milligrams Nandrolone decanoate intramuscularly every 2 weeks or 250 milligrams Sustanon every 2 weeks, which contains, well, basically 80 milligrams more active steroids discounting for the esters. The weekly intake of testosterone was 40 milligrams higher than Nandrolone. After 12 weeks of treatment, Nandrolone increased the skin fold thickness of the triceps and scapula significantly more compared to baseline and the control groups, while the testosterone group saw a more pronounced increase in body fat levels, which also contributes to skin thickness. And when you scroll down to table 2, you see that the tricep skin fold thickness of the Nandrolone group is, well, 5 times more the placebo or the control group, and, well, at least 1.5 times the testosterone groups. And with the scapular thickness, it's, let's say, twice the thickness of the placebo control group and almost twice the thickness of the testosterone group. So that's some serious, significant changes at a very low dose of, well, 75 milligrams Nandrolone decanoate weekly. So this is where the bodybuilders always mention anything from 50 milligrams upwards and my skin turns into seal skin. But you guys know me, I do my meta-analysis with a passion properly. Other studies show that Nandrolone decanoate treatment had no tangible significant effects on skin fold thickness, whether that's on the triceps, the scapula, or other skin fold areas of the body. In many which cases, they were actually investigating the thickness of adipose tissue, not exactly the thickness of the skin. As always, all of the citations are down below. Last study I want to highlight, performed by Clark et al., published on March 1977, very long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. The effects of intracutaneous injections of micronized crystalline suspensions of nandrolone phenylpropionate in the skin of female hairless hamsters. I was able to find this study that shows that nandrolone phenylpropionate thickens the skin 2 days following intracutaneous administrations, but the skin thickness recovers back to baseline 7 days after the injection. In the discussion, the researchers specifically mentioned that the thickening of the skin is mostly an inflammatory or encapsulation response, not a long-lasting effect of the nandrolone decanoate injections in the intracutaneous space. At least this study somewhat explains what happens following subcutaneous or intercutaneous administrations. And it leaves us with some dubious extrapolation. Unlike testosterone or dinotestosterone derivatives, 19-ortestosterone derivatives offer mild to moderate to even strong progesterogenic activity through the progesterone receptor. And these effects are far more pronounced compared to circulating progesterone, as exogenous administrations of 19-ortestosterone derivatives far exceed endogenous progesterone production. Since there's usually a testosterone base in the picture contributing to sufficient estradiol levels, and since Nandrolone and Trenbolone have mild estrogenic effects, these effects compound with the circulating estradiol already present, thickening the skin potentially. And not only that, the testosterone base will compound with the increasing effects of 19-ortestosterone derivatives regarding epidermal growth factor levels, Trenbolone specifically in the presence of circulating estradiol, which is going to take place because you have a testosterone base after all. In the presence of circulating estradiol, Trenbolone promotes insulin-like growth factor 1 secretion from the liver and through autocrine signaling. So if insulin-like growth factor levels are up, you have a testosterone base and sufficient 19-ortestosterone derivatives in the picture, super elevated epidermal growth factors contributing to thickening of the skin. And then the significant increase in protein, collagen, and elastin synthesis within the various layers of the skin Trenbolone's anti-catabolic effects within the layers of the skin, preserving protein, collagen, and elastin, the proliferative effects within the epidermis, the lipogenesis effects of Nandrolone by raising serum estradiol levels, potentially, unless you put an aromatase inhibitor in place, and the overall progestogenic effects in all of the layers of the skin ultimately contribute to thickening of the skin in a dose-dependent fashion. Now, these effects may not be as pronounced on a Nandrolone or Trestolone only cycle, as circulating estradiol levels are usually towards the bottom of the reference range or maybe even below it, and testosterone levels are usually completely bottomed out. And it's the testosterone and the estradiol that ultimately contribute to skin thickness, especially when 19-ortestosterone derivatives are being used. And depending on the dose and duration that you took, progestogenic 19-ortestosterone derivatives, it might take anywhere between 4 weeks to 12 weeks or even longer for skin thickness to recover back to baseline. And if you get fat in the meantime while removing these progestogenic 19-ortestosterone derivatives, then the seal skin and the rhinoceros look will simply remain. Although you can speed up this process with stanozolol, winstrol, which might inhibit the progesterone receptors and offset the skin thickening effects even when you take Trenbolone, Nandrolone, or Trestolone during your off-season or cutting cycle. Stanozolol might be potent enough for these skin thickening effects to never occur at all. But let's save that for a follow-up video. Let me know down below if you would like to see it ASAP. For now, we're out of time. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the YouTube description section. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at VigorSteve. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. A Trenbolone sandwich without the stanozolol frontable bicep for you guys. I think I could have significantly less thick skin than I do right now if I add in a low and effective dose of stanozolol, but I like my lipids the way they are for now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.